Hello everyone, how are you doing? My name's TryPokemac, and I'm doing pretty good myself. Welcome to step 2 of my Johto Journey. This week's challenge is the inverse of golds. So rather than using only Johto original Pokemon, I can only use Pokemon that add on to Kanto Pokemon. But really just new evolutions. Because I don't want to use baby Pokemon in a game where you can't find them in the wild. And I don't think it would be fair to catch them already evolved. With that out of the way, remember, as always, I name my team after a theme, and for Gold, Silver, and Crystal, my rivals' names will share a theme. If you can guess either theme, or you have ideas for future challenges or future themes, leave them down below. If you guess correctly, I'll interact with your comment, and if I use your idea, I'll credit you in the video. Starting Silver, I chose Horsey. Yeah, I changed Chikorita into Horsey for two reasons. Firstly, Horsey is really hard to find in these games, and at level 5 will only have access to Bubble, and I didn't want to spend forever hitting a Chikorita with Bubble. This choice ended up haunting me because Horsey's moveset is actually pretty bad, so my starter couldn't really compete until it evolved into Kingdra. So while my first rival battle was pretty easy, I struggled with the gym leaders for a while. Either way, I named my new friend Folgers the Horsey. After naming my rival Octavian, I struggled to catch a Bellsprout, who I named 8 O'Clock Brain, but then had way less trouble catching Darjeeling the Zubat. Then, once I was finally in Violet City, I traded away 8 O'Clock for Rocky the Onyx. This Faulkner fight in Silver was a bit of a struggle for me, because my team didn't have access to many good offensive moves. Darjeeling only had Leech Life and Supersonic, Folgers had Bubble and Smokescreen, and Rocky had Tackle and Screech at level 9. So I knew my best bet was to get Pidgey out of the way as soon as possible, and then hit Pidgeotto hard with a bunch of status moves, with the main goal being to preserve Rocky as long as possible and decreasing the chance of it getting hit by a super effective Mudslap to as low as possible. Luckily, Folger's Bubble was able to take down Pidgey in 3 turns, which meant the real threat Pidgeotto came out. But unfortunately, that meant I had to rely on Smokescreen and accuracy drops to survive the battle. I put a berry on Folgers, hoping that the boost would mean I could get off enough Smokescreens to get around Pidgeotto, and after setting up enough that I felt comfortable, I switched over to Bubble while Folgers had 1 health left. Then I switched over to Darjeeling and tried to hit Pidgeotto with Supersonic, but that move has horrible accuracy, so it was a low accuracy move versus a low accuracy Mon for a few more turns. And once I finally got Pidgeotto confused, it did more damage to itself than Darjeeling could do with Leech Life. I wasted a lot of time because I didn't want to switch in Rocky, while Darjeeling could heal herself a little every turn. Then, at the very end of the battle, Pidgeotto snapped out of confusion, and then I hit Supersonic first try the next turn, taking Pidgey to 1 health that Darjeeling was finally able to leech away. So despite all the setup I did, and all the planning I did to make sure that Rocky could hit the field and do as much as possible, I ended up winning the fight without even using him. But full disclosure, he did end up being the MVP on my team anyway. Grabbed the old rod on Route 32, and after a quick trip back to Violet City, caught Georgia the Poliwag. Faulkner, Bugsy, and Octavian's battle in Azalea Town are the 3 battles that I was most worried about in Gen 2. Partly because graded Pokemon like Rocky stop obeying me at level 10. And for those of you that don't know, in Generation 2, the Zephyr badge does not increase that to 20, the Hive badge increases it to 30. Which means that at level 16, the level that Bugsy's Ace is at, Rocky is guaranteed to not obey me, so I can't rely on him and his rock moves. So for the battle with Bugsy, I relied on my other team members. With all of that information in mind, I also decided to take on Bugsy before Octavian. That way, with Rocky obeying me, I could show Octavian the full might of my team and avoid an unfortunate reoccurrence of the last battle in Azalea Town. I led Folgers against Metapod because I knew he at least could take one of the 2 cocoons, but would most likely not be able to beat Scyther. And the amount of string shots Metapod got against Folgers meant that I was too scared to keep him in against Kakuna in case he got poisoned, so I swapped over to Georgia. This battle was when I started to see that Georgia was going to do a lot better than Folgers for a while, mostly because she had access to Water Gun, and Kakuna wasn't able to poison Georgia, so she was able to maximize the number of turns she had to put Scyther to sleep with Hypnosis, which ended up hitting on the first turn, much to my surprise. So, with Scyther asleep, I swapped over to Folgers to set up smoke screens to try and keep Fury Cutter as weak as possible, which Bugsy ended up doing for me because he switched his strategy to using Quick Attack, which did a lot when it hit, but luckily Smokescreen saved me more times than I'd like to admit. Luckily, Folgers also gained access to his third move right before battling Bugsy at level 15, Leer, which I used to lower Scyther's defense as much as possible. But, like my plan to use Rocky in the last battle, never came to pass because Georgia didn't get knocked out. And looking back, wouldn't have mattered much anyway because Darjeeling had Bite, which was special in Gen 2. And Folgers fell, which became an unfortunate trend until he evolved. Georgia was able to easily pick up the slack with Water Gun, and Quick Attack missed enough that even though Georgia took a lot of damage every time she was hit, she was easily able to survive. So, Georgia ended up taking down Scyther during her first gym battle, which meant I got the Hive badge and was guaranteed to have Rocky obey me to at least level 30. After that battle, I healed up my team and got ready to battle Octavian. Knowing that he would open with Ghastly, I chose Darjeeling since she knew Bite, but that didn't save her from being paralyzed turn 1 by Lick. Something that didn't stop her from beating Ghastly, but did cause a lot of problems when Octavian followed Ghastly with his own Zubat. Thanks to Paralysis, his Zubat was able to outspeed her. So while their bites did about equal damage to each other, he was safe enough that he went for Supersonic, which of course landed on his first try. Meaning the next turn I haven't done the math on this, but I think like a 30% chance of actually hitting my move between the two status conditions, and of course I got the worst outcome of hurting myself in Confusion. So even though Darjeeling broke out of Confusion the next turn, she was not going to stay on to finish Zubat. When she fell, I brought in Rocky the Onyx, and he was able to squish the Zubat like a bug, which I have a lot of experience of Rocky doing that because I did the bug catching contest later. When Quilava came out, I switched over to Folgers to try and get some confidence back for the little guy since I knew he was taking it hard that he wasn't doing very well in the gyms. And unfortunately, my confidence was misplaced because Ember ended up doing more damage to him than Bubble was doing to Quilava. So when Folgers fell, I switched over to Rocky, who had to take a smokescreen and missed his first rock throw, but the second made contact, knocking Quilava out. Which I guess means that my less type-diverse team did better against my rival in Azalea Town than my team in Gold, which I believe was way more type-diverse. The only thing I did before Whitney was catch Dumont the Scyther in the bug-catching contest. And I messed up and damaged her, so I ended up getting 3rd place instead of 1st. At this point in the challenge, I didn't have a good answer for Whitney. My best option was probably Rocky, so knowing that, I decided to lead with Dumont to try and set up Fury Cutters with Clefairy. But it's just my luck that on turn 1, Clefairy's Metronome turned into Fly. So I decided to move on to phase 2 of my plan really early and just swapped straight into Rocky, and Fly ended up missing. I then had to use 3 headbutts to take down Clefairy because it lived on 1 health, which also meant that Rocky took a little bit of extra damage from Double Slap, but I don't think that ended up mattering in the long run. Once Miltank came out, I swapped over to using Screech in an attempt to bring Miltank's defense down to 0, and after 3 turns, it was successful. But even after that, Stab Dig was not enough to knock out Miltank, only taking it to red health. So for the next 2 turns, I struggled against a Miltank that was using Milk Drink with Headbutt until I was finally able to knock it out. After that, though, I am surprised Whitney never went for Attract even though Rocky is male. Unless she tried and missed because of the dig turns. After battling a sentient tree, I was able to evolve Darjeeling to Golbat before facing my rival. I chose Rocky to battle Octavian, mostly because I knew he'd lead Haunter and I wanted to see how Rocky would do against the ghosts in the gym. Which, of course, meant that I'd have horrible luck during the battle. because Haunter was left with a single sliver of health by the first attack, so of course Rocky was then also paralyzed by Lick before he was able to finish it off. And of course, Zubat knows Confuse right now, so I'm guaranteed to be confused as soon as it hits the field. Which meant that Rocky hurt himself in confusion and then missed the next rock throw. Before he was finally able to beat Zubat, he was brought to a single point of health above exactly half, 27 out of 52. I think my luck turned and Rocky broke out of confusion before beating Zubat because I didn't have to deal with it when I got off a dig which one-shot Magnemite. And after being beaten up and critical hit by Quilava, he was able to knock it out with one single HP remaining while paralyzed. The moral, I guess, is always get Rocky, especially if you choose Chikorita, because he counters 5 out of 6 of your rival's Pokemon, 6 out of 6 if you give it Crunch. Despite all of my bad luck, Rocky somehow swept my rival's entire team, and I did not plan for that. After releasing the beasts, I went back down to Goldenrod City, where I grabbed Boostello the Eevee, and then bred it for Irish Breakfast the Eevee. I had to struggle with Gen 2 breeding mechanics, but it meant that Irish Breakfast evolved into Espeon way faster, and meant that it was actually able to have a Psychic-type move. Then, in Morty's gym, Darjeeling evolved into Crobat, and then Georgia evolved into Poliwhirl. Since Morty doesn't use Misdreavus, and only uses the Kanto ghosts, and I bred Irish Breakfast, letting it get Confusion at level 16, it meant that it was able to easily sweep Morty's team. Ghastly was one-shot. The first Haunter was one-shot. Oh, what's over there? Not Gengar. He was also one-shot. And since Gengar couldn't even do anything, obviously the second Haunter wasn't going to do anything. At 2 times speed, this battle took 40 seconds. The battle was so easy, I don't even remember if I had a contingency plan in case Irish Breakfast went down. Before I marathoned the last 4 gyms, I evolved Rocky into Steelix and Dumont into Scizor. I had to evolve her exactly at level 30, because Scyther only gets Wing Attack at level 30, and Scizor only gets Metal Claw at level 30. Neither get any Flying or Steel Stab at any other time. Nor do either get any Bug Stab aside from by TM. Darjeeling also didn't get a Flying move until level 30 either, which was only a problem for the trainers leading up to Chuck in his gym, because I only had one Pokemon who could do super effective damage. But at level 30, that means that my access to coverage spikes from 1 to 3. Because now I have flying moves on 2 more Pokemon, one of which resists fighting and the other is neutral. So, for the battle, I led with Dumont and traded a single wing attack with Primeape, which knocked it out before it could do anything, and then halved Poliwrath's health on the next turn. But I was hit by the 50% move Dynamic Punch, which confused Dumont, meaning that she only hurt herself for the rest of her time on the field. And I was too prideful to swap away from her, before I was finally forced to swap to Darjeeling, who was able to finish off Poliwrath in a single move. While I feel like Chuck's a bit of an oddity, that he's always either way easier than you expect him to be, or way harder than you expect him to be, Price is almost always a complete disappointment. So of course, I led Dumont and used Fury Cutter against Seal and Dugong. Because I never missed an attack against Seal, when I got to Dugong, I was almost able to knock it out in one hit. Then, rather than attack or anything, Dugong rested the next turn, which meant that as long as I didn't miss Fury Cutter, I was guaranteed to knock it out in one hit. I love the Mamoswine line, but Price's Piloswine, I'm pretty sure, ended up doing less damage than his Seal, and I misplayed by going for Metal Claw instead of Fury Cutter. And I only didn't use Fury Cutter because I always get confused if Ground is the one that resists Bug or the other way around. Johto really does go for the entire spectrum of being locked in the gym with the gym leader, and the gym leader being locked in the gym with you. Before Jasmine, Fulgurs evolved into Seadra. I remember as a kid being terrified to battle Jasmine because of how imposing her Steelix was, but now that I'm an adult with my own Steelix, Her first, not Magneton, only survived a turn because I used Dig. I think I scared her though because she brought out her ace Steelix second instead of after her second Magnemite. And I'll admit, her Steelix was able to take Dig way better than the Magnemites since it only did about a third of his health, but when he retaliated with Iron Tail and actually hit it, it only did 10 damage. Then, when Rocky came back up after the second dig, she went for Screech instead of actually attacking. I understand trying to set up to take down your opponent's imposing Pokemon, but her Steelix was the only one that could have done anything. So when it fell, Magnemite also only survived a turn because I used Dig. Compared to the last three, Octavian and Claire actually were a bit of a challenge. Emphasis on a bit for Octavian. I taught Georgia Ice Punch as a TM in preparation for Claire, and led her against Octavian's Golbat, who actually survived a turn, and was then able to confuse Georgia, which worked, bringing her all the way to red health before she hit through confusion and knocked out Golbat. Then I brought out Rocky to deal with Magnemite because he can do it really easily, and then I swapped over to Fulgurs against Quilava. And since he was finally evolved, he knocked out Quilava with a single Surf. And Darjeeling was fast enough to deal with Haunter, so it was no problem for her to take it down. Golbat and Steelix were the only two on my rival's team to actively do anything this round. Golbat has access to Confuse Ray, which is always a bit of a problem to get around if I can't outspeed Oko. And I don't really have a good answer to his Sneasel at this point, so I can only hit it with neutral damage. Aside from Rocky, but I don't want to over-rely on a single Pokemon on my team as much as I did in the last match with my rival. Which is why I set up the rule that each member of my team has to participate against my final rival battle or the champion. I could clearly use a single member of my team set up with something like Swords Dance or Calm Mind and then sweep an entire party, and there are certainly times where that is incredibly funny to do. But having to constantly switch around adds elements of risk that I don't think are present in other playstyles. And on a subjective level also makes me feel a bit more connected to my team that I'm giving each of them a chance to shine in an incredibly important match. Even if some champion or rival teams don't really ally themselves with that and I end up using a Zangoose against Steven's Metagross. Finally, before Claire, Fulgurs evolved into Kingdra and Georgia into Politoed. I think the challenge Claire as a gym leader presents as the final gym of Johto works really well, even though the champion Lance just has a better version of her team. I feel like there's an alternate universe out there where they made Karen the champion and demoted Lance to the 8th gym leader. Regardless of that, even though now Fulgurs was fully evolved to Kingdra, I was still a little trepidatious about challenging Claire because my only Dragon-type move, and therefore the only move that can strike Kingdra with super effective damage, was Twister. So I spent a lot of time off-screen getting coins and bought Blizzard, and hoped it would hit. And then on turn 1, it didn't, so even though it was able to one-shot Dragonair, Fulgurs was not going to get through the second one after being hit by a super effective Dragon Breath. So I brought in Irish Breakfast, who was able to beat the second Dragonair, and then almost one-shot the third, but ended up paralyzed and hit by Slam. So, since it was already super low health, I used Swift, which crit and knocked out the Dragonair, leading to Kingdra, who I had no super effective moves for. Psybeam did quite a bit of damage, but since I moved second, Surf and Hyper Beam were able to knock out Irish Breakfast. So I swapped over to Dumont and spammed Fury Cutter, which did end up winning, although the first didn't do much on the recharge turn, it crit the next hit. Dumont took a Surf, but it forced Claire to heal, meaning I got a free third hit, and because Dumont and Kingdra had a speed tie, I got off a fourth, which was enough to beat Kingdra. My rival at this point wasn't much more than a speed bump, but I'm also just now realizing I could have used Dumont against Sneasel back in Goldenrod, because Bug and Steel moves are both super effective, and as we can see in this battle, we're able to one-shot it. Either way, my rival brought out his Typhlosion next, who I swapped to Folgers, because gone are the minutes when Typhlosion was an actual threat to Folgers. Golbat, who came out third, however, is still annoying because of Confuse Ray, and I swapped to Irish Breakfast, who did more damage to themselves using Confusion than Golbat did to them. A lot like Faulkner's Pidgeotto now that I think about it. Because I guess every time I decide to use Confusion or Evasion strats in order to save myself, I have to pay in blood later. At least, unlike Faulkner's Pidgeotto, Irish Breakfast was able to save itself, because even though Golbat and itself were doing a lot of damage to him, he broke out with 9 health remaining and was able to one-shot Golbat with Psybeam. I knew that he would probably be knocked out if I decided to use him against anyone else, and I didn't want to give my rival the satisfaction of having knocked out even one of my Pokemon during this battle, so I just swapped straight to Rocky because I know from experience that he can tank whatever Magneton has for him. Which worked because Sonic Boom only does 20 damage, and Rocky was easily able to retaliate with Dig, one-shotting Magneton. Then my rival sent out his new Kadabra, and I met it with Darjeeling, knowing that at most it was probably only going to be able to set up Future Sight, which it did. And because Darjeeling was faster than it, she was able to OHKO it with Wing Attack, and I swapped over to Georgia, who was easily able to deal with Haunter even after being hit with Future Sight and Haunter setting up Curse. I like to think that he doesn't get the 2 trade evolutions until Kanto because he's just mean to people and they don't want to trade with him, compared to me who changes impossible evolutions, especially in this game because it would take me longer to find a Metal Coat than it would for me to actually beat the game. After beating my rival, I deposited Georgia into the PC, in exchange for Bustelo, who I evolved into Umbreon and led against Will. Bustelo's first feint attack almost one-shot the leading Xatu, leaving it with what I can only assume is 1 HP, because every Johto game loves leaving Pokemon with 1 HP. So Xatu number 1 actually got off a little damage, but he fell anyway. I knew that Will's Slowbro had amnesia, so I did my best to get around that by using Shadow Ball. In hindsight, I believe Slowbro could have been an actual threat had I not been able to beat it in 3 turns, because the setup it did lowered the amount of damage it would take, and if it had a physical move, it would retaliate pretty hard. And it's a really good thing that Bustelo didn't get knocked out at any time, because aside from not having very good psychic coverage without him, I don't have any fire or electric typing at this point. I do believe that Dumont probably could have cleaned up really well, but if Slowbro had set up to the point that it was dangerous, I don't know how I would have fared. But Jinx and Executor together would probably have fallen just as easily then as they did this time. Jinx missed her one chance at actually doing damage when she missed Double Slap before I knocked her out. Executor did get off an Egg Bomb, making it one of the 3 Pokemon to actually do damage, but it still fell in 2 hits. Unfortunately, though, the game still thinks I need to be punished for using Confusion against Faulkner. So the second Xatu's first move was Confuse Ray, which meant that I had to deal with Bustelo hurting himself in Confusion over and over while Xatu just stood there. What finally turned the tide was Bustelo and I getting really angry because Will had the audacity to heal his Xatu while Bustelo hurt himself in Confusion. So Bustelo broke out of Confusion and hit Xatu with a 2-shot knockout. As much as I respect Koga from going from Gym Leader into Elite Four member, his Fortress was the only member of his team I didn't have a direct answer for since I don't have any fire options. So when Irish Breakfast easily knocked out Ariados, I just swapped to Folgers in hopes that I could brute force my way past the Steel type, which worked far better than I actually expected since Surf knocked Fortress down to red HP with the first hit. Fortress was able to set up spikes and then used Swift against Folgers, but it still got knocked out by the second Surf. Third out was Venomoth, and I made the oddly tactical choice to send in Darjeeling, because Toxic didn't work against her, and then when I used Fly, Venomoth missed Psychic. I didn't end up giving it the chance to go for the hat trick of failure because I knocked it out with Fly the next turn. Then the minimizing Muck came out. I misclicked and brought out Bustelo, and I don't know why I forgot he had Feint Attack like Devon did back in Gold. So I wasted a turn and let Muck get off an extra minimize while I swapped over to Irish Breakfast. Of course, I think the game was finally willing to forgive my crime against Faulkner because Psychic hit minimize on the first try, knocking out Muck in one hit, and then Irish Breakfast was able to outspeed Oko Crobat before it became a problem. Which meant that Koga ended up being the shortest battle I had in the Silver Elite Four compared to the Gold Elite Four, where I spent way more time battling him. And unlike Gold, I ended up spending a fair amount of time battling Bruno. I led Darjeeling against Bruno since I knew she could probably solo the entire team minus Onyx, but didn't account for Hitmontop having Detect, which I should have known since it's one of the only fighting type moves Hitmontop gets in this generation. So of course, rather than change my strategy, I went for Fly a second time like Bruno was just gonna let it land. Finally on turn 5, I just switched to Wing Attack, which one-shot Hitmontop. The Bruno fight went on way longer than it should have because I kept making dumb choices about moves. I swapped to Rocky against his Onyx, and then rather than use Earthquake, which would have hit no matter what and done more damage, I decided to try for Iron Tail. It should have been no surprise that it missed before I decided to use Earthquake and one-shot Onyx. It seems by the second half of the fight, or I guess the latter 3/5, I actually learned my lesson because against Hitmonlee, I just went for Wing Attack instead of Fly, which knocked it out in one hit. Then when Hitmonchan came out, I realized that since Wing Attack knocked out Hitmonlee in one hit, it would probably do the same to them, and guess what? It did. The only member of Bruno's team to survive a single Wing Attack was his Machamp, who survived and got off a Rock Slide. Since it got him into red health, I knew that Bruno would have healed next, so I don't think it would have mattered had I used Fly or Wing Attack, because either one Fly or two Wing Attacks was probably going to be enough to defeat Machamp. I wonder if it was a pattern that I ended up doing a bunch of misplays against both fighting specialists in this game. Regardless of that, it was finally time to move on to Karen. I really like Elite Four Karen, in theory. While I think it probably would have been nice to have her as the champion, I also have to admit that this fight made me angry. This fight is a perfect example of the saying, sometimes in Pokemon, the only stat you have to worry about raising or lowering is your opponent's HP to 0. I don't know or care if that's an actual saying, but I'm using it from now on. I know in future games and challenges I will probably have trouble or make trouble for myself by being reckless, but sometimes the game actively discourages you from taking the tactical approach. Case in point, this specific Umbreon. I've made it no secret I don't necessarily like Flareon, but this specific Umbreon is the worst evolution because it has Sand Attack and Confuse Ray. I tried to set up with Dumont to prove that I can do it, but this Umbreon stood in the way, and after swapping out and swapping back in to try and redo it, the Umbreon continued the cycle. So when I finally gave up and swapped to Fulgurs and almost knocked out Umbreon, it decided to Sand Attack at 1 HP. After finally being done with Umbreon, I swapped back to Dumont against Vileplume, who immediately paralyzed her, which meant I just spent 2.5 minutes dancing around this Umbreon, finally knock it out, and then have to spend another 1.5 minutes of, again, real-world time knocking out this Vileplume. Sure, I could have put a Paralyzed Cure Berry on Dumont or looked at Karen's moveset ahead of time to see that Vileplume had Stun Spore, to which I would also say, hey, there's nothing stopping Karen from using Stun Spore a second time, so after my Paralyzed Cure Berry is used up, what's gonna stop the second? I can't use items in battle. But after dealing with paralysis and sand attacks, I finally was able to knock out a single Pokemon with Swords Dance boosts, before Houndoom came out and one-shot my quad-weak Bug Steel type Dumont. At that point, since Dumont was down and I didn't have any other setup moves, I just decided to go for only super effective attacks. A single Surf from Fulgurs was enough to knock out Houndoom, and then when Gengar came out, I swapped over to Rocky. Of course, I didn't realize that a Gengar in the Elite Four would still have Lick, so of course on switch in, Lick hit Rocky, and guess what? He was paralyzed. Which meant on the next turn, because Rocky couldn't get off Earthquake, Gengar was able to use Curse, which did make it easier to knock out, but also put a time limit on how long I could use Rocky. especially since Rocky wasn't able to one-hit knock out Murkrow with Rock Throw, meaning he took burst damage. Twice because he missed it the next turn before I think Murkrow had pity on me and force-swapped him out to Folgers, who was able to finish the battle with Surf. Like in Gold, I ended up taking a really long break between battling Karen and Lance purely so that I could cool off and start making more tactical decisions again during the next match. I don't want to be annoying by constantly bringing up that I don't have Fire or Electric, but that meant that I had to use Boostello against Lance's Gyarados because I had no other option. So I used Feint Attack over and over just because I needed the assurance that it would always hit, while Gyarados first used Rain Dance and then used Hyper Beam on the next turn, meaning I was easily able to take it down because Lance didn't heal while Gyarados recharged. Of course, Lance has no consideration for my mental health because on switch-in, Dumont was paralyzed. But to add insult to injury, Lance's Dragonite landed 3 Thunders in a row. But even though he brought Dumont down to red health, she ended up beating the Dragonite with Metal Claw, after Lance missed his last 2 Thunders. I think if Dumont was knocked out here, I may not have gone all the way to red, I may have just beaten Lance and given up on silver. I mean, Dumont was knocked out, but it was my conscious choice because Charizard came out and I wanted a clean switch. I will say it's a little cruel of me that I let Dumont get knocked out by Flamethrower 2 battles in a row. I ended up going back to using Fly over Wing Attack. I'm not entirely sure at this point why. I haven't done the calculations, but I do think 4 Wing Attacks probably would have been able to bring down Charizard the same way that 2 Flies did. But either way, Darjeeling was easily able to make her way past the Kanto starter I didn't choose. Unfortunately, when I swapped to Rocky, he wasn't so lucky because although Dragonite missed Blizzard the first time, and Rocky hit Rock Slide the first time, Dragonite hit Blizzard the 2nd through 4th, while Rocky missed the next 2 times before he was knocked out. The worst part was, Rocky didn't have a Sand Attack against him. I was just that unlucky that after battling Karen, I missed moves without even needing a reason. Also being hit by moves that should have missed more often. So I decided to swap over to Irish Breakfast just so that I could finish off this Dragonite, which I was easily able to do, because Irish Breakfast was able to outspeed and knock out Dragonite with a single Psychic. Lance then brought out his Aerodactyl and I swapped over to Folgers. Since all 6 of my Pokemon had done battle at least once, it didn't matter how I beat Lance's last 2 Pokemon, so long as I did it. So, after Aerodactyl did less than half of Folger's health with a Hyper Beam, I knocked it out with a single Surf. And I left Folgers in against Lance's Ace Dragonite. Because of how many times Lance hit Blizzard and Thunder, I decided to try it for myself and ended up getting it off and one-shotting his Ace Dragonite, defeating the champion. Also, in hindsight, this meant that I beat his Ace with his cousin Claire's Ace. With that, I was finally done with the Johto Elite Four and could move on to Kanto. Once I reached Kanto, the first thing I did was grab a Porygon from the game corner. I named them Duncan and immediately was able to evolve them into Porygon 2. Unfortunately, Gen 2 was not kind to Porygon. I forgot to grab the Psychic TM, so it was stuck with Psybeam. Only electric coverage it can give is Zap Cannon or Thunder, so I had to sacrifice a move slot for Lock-On, and there's no Eviolite, or Porygon Z. Not that the last 2 ended up really mattering. Duncan ended up doing really well despite all of the handicaps, though. I met Octavian in Mount Moon for the last time, the second to last hurdle through this challenge, before I took on Red. Well, for this video, I mean I took on Blue after this because he was a higher level than my rival's team. But either way, I sent out Dumont against Sneasel, dropping it with a single Metal Claw. And following that, my rival sent out his starter, Typhlosion. So I responded by sending out Folgers, and realized that since Thunder Punch is a TM, it meant that his Typhlosion still had Smokescreen, which it used and forced Folgers to miss his first Surf. Ironically enough though, the next turn Smokescreen missed and Surf made contact, knocking out Typhlosion. And although I didn't have to worry about accuracy problems anymore, Golbat reminded me that it still had Confuse Ray, which ultimately didn't do anything because Irish Breakfast hit through Confusion to one-shot Golbat with Psychic. And then learned Morning Sun, finally getting rid of Sand Attack, but unless I used it against Blue, I don't think I ever had the opportunity to use it against Red. But fourth out from my rival was his Magneton, who I responded to with Rocky, and Earthquake knocked it out in one hit. But don't worry, this wasn't a complete sweep. My rival actually did knock out one of my Pokemon. I thought that since it had only used Future Sight in the battle before, his Alakazam didn't have Psychic or was not likely to use it, so when I swapped over to Darjeeling, she was crit one-shot. So I decided to bring out Dumont, who was able to one-shot Alakazam with Metal Claw. Considering Bite was a special move, I don't even know if Darjeeling could have one-shot Alakazam with it. Had she survived, I probably would have gone for Wing Attack though. The fall of Alakazam either way led to a 5v1, so I sent Duncan out against his final Pokemon, Gengar, who of course went for Curse, which meant that even though Duncan only had Psybeam, so long as it made contact, Gengar was going to be knocked out. Kudos to Gengar, he did try to prevent that from happening by using Confuse Ray. But like Irish Breakfast had before him, Duncan hit through Confusion to one-shot Gengar, or I guess two-shot considering he used Curse. Having defeated my rival and the 8 Kanto gyms off-screen, I went and battled Red for the second time in this series. I said in the last video that when I played through Gold, I viewed Pikachu as the biggest threat because it had the highest level, but that's not necessarily true. Red always leads with his Pikachu, so you can always lead with a ground type or a Pokemon with ground coverage to ice it out, which Rocky is more than capable of doing, so on the second overall turn of the battle, I had already brought down Red's ace. Against Espeon, I chose to use Fury Cutter over Metal Claw. That way it could build up enough damage against Espeon that I could easily deal with Venusaur without a fire type or having to rely on one of my 2 psychic coverage Pokemon, keeping them in reserve for larger threats like Snorlax. So even though Espeon's psychic attacks were enough to bring Dumont all the way down to red health, she had already built up an 80 base power Fury Cutter, so even Stevens. And I put that high power Fury Cutter to good use on Venusaur, which chose to go for Solar Beam over Giga Drain, meaning I was able to double its attack one last time and beat Venusaur with a full power 160 Fury Cutter. I am curious to know that if Charizard didn't outspeed Dumont here, how much damage would I have done with my full power Fury Cutter? But at this point, Charizard using Flamethrower was a mercy, and I swapped over to Fulgurs, who easily washed away Charizard. At this point in the battle, however, even though Red only had 2 Pokemon, his real main event came out next, Snorlax. I probably touched on this in Gold, but to reiterate, Snorlax here has Amnesia and Rest, which means it can set itself up to be a complete wall to special attackers and get rid of any status conditions that could help you, like Poison or Burn. And I sent out Darjeeling since she's more or less a physical attacker, and while she could dish out a fair amount of damage, took a lot in return, so she eventually fell. And once she did, I brought in Irish Breakfast, knowing that Snorlax had set up Amnesia already, but hoping that my Psychic could make it past it and knock it out so I could avoid Rest, which luckily I did, taking Red down to his last Pokemon. I debated what to do here since I did have a clear advantage of numbers, and ultimately decided that I wanted to swap to Duncan, but to give him the best shot possible, I decided to sack off Rocky because I knew that Rocky probably wouldn't survive one Surf, but would definitely lose on a second. I had also decided to run Zap Cannon over Thunder on Duncan, so I needed time to set up Mind Readers, and in order to do that in the most efficient way possible, I needed Duncan at full health. If Zap Cannon hits, it always leaves the target with Paralysis, which gave me just a little bit more of an advantage so that Duncan could use 2 Psybeams to finish off Blastoise. And while the first didn't knock out Blastoise, it left him confused, which was ultimately funny even though it never actually came into play after that. And the fall of Blastoise signaled the end of this challenge. I had beaten Pokemon Silver with only Kanto Evolution Pokemon. And ultimately, I can say that it probably would have been funnier if I just beat this game with Kanto Pokemon. I really did enjoy the team I had despite it not having electric or fire coverage, and I had fun for most of this challenge, minus Karen, and Lance really just added insult to injury. I think something should have been done in Johto to ensure that when you battle the second to last person of the main game, they're not using moves that Pidgey was using back on Route 1. I also think this should go both ways, that players should have a wider access of moves, because I felt dirty having Sand Attack on my Espeon until after I battled Silver in the post-game. I did really enjoy playing through this game, maybe not 3 times in a row, but Scizor and Steelix are just great Pokemon in general. And overall, none of my team fell short of expectations after they had already fully evolved. I do hesitate recommending this challenge if you're playing on an actual cartridge or the eShop copy because of how difficult it is to get evolution items, however. The last time I played Crystal, I had both Scizor and Steelix on my Elite Four team, which meant I had to farm Magnemite in order to get Metal Coats. So unless you already have a friend to trade with who's willing to beat the main game twice to get the 2 guaranteed Metal Coats and give them to you, I don't necessarily see how practical it is to have both on a team. While I would recommend trying out my gold challenge of only using Johto original Pokemon, I think this game works better as an add-on to that challenge, allowing yourself to use Pokemon that got better in Johto. With all of that in mind, I'll tell you all that my next upload is going to be Pokemon Crystal, but with only water types. Remember to love yourselves, and I'll see you in my next upload.